Are we rolling? Okay. Welcome. Thank you guys for coming. It's really too bad there's a few people who really wanted to come, couldn't be here, but it is November and weather and things happen. In fact, it's Sunday, November 9th, 2025. It was about three to 4 years ago that Damien and I first connected, and about Jacob Fowler, who was the first permanent settler of Berlin, Vermont. And permanent means there was a couple of other guys who came before him, but he was the first one that stayed for more than a few months, and there were descendants of his. There's so many things to learn about Berlin, but we're going to stay focused here. And so Damien and I went back and forth a little bit about Jacob. And of course, when somebody's interested in a topic, I end up wanting to dig out more or either find what more we might have at the Historical Society or dig out more. And I used to drive Richard Turner nuts. I just jumped from one project to another because people have interest in various topics, and this is interesting, that's interesting, and I don't stay with it. So when Damien and I were back in touch recently, and I asked him about doing a program here for us, I tried to get back focused, and now I wish I could just stay home for a week and just continue with some stuff that I've been digging out. Damien's official title is Dr. Damien Costello. He's the Director of Postgraduate Studies at NAIITS, which is an Indigenous Learning Community. I hope that he will first tell us a little bit more as far as his background and what got him started looking into Jacob Fowler. It's kind of interesting because you can see from all the stuff that's out here, Jacob did get mentioned in our history, which included some maybe exaggerated tales about hunting and all, but who's to say? I wasn't there, right? You can only go by other accounts that you've seen. D.P. Thompson, who actually grew up in Berlin and is known for his writing and all, some of his writing was fiction, but a lot of it was based on true accounts. It's always hard to tell where one leaves off and another starts. But I'm going to turn it over to Damien because he's been doing much more research on this than me.
Thank you, Corinne. Well, real briefly, I can give you some context. This is where I work, and it's an Indigenous Theological Graduate School. We offer a PhD and 4 master's degrees, so that's my professional work. That's based on my research. This is my main area of research, Nicholas Black Elk, Lakota Holy Person, wonderful book. I encourage you to read it if you haven't. But this, my academic training, my interests, and my professional work a few years ago led me to ask the question, what's my community's history in terms of the native past and just history in general? So I'm from Graniteville. I was born in Rutland, but I moved to Graniteville, I think it was about 4 years old. Went to Spalding, worked at Grand Union in Montpelier when I was in high school. Have been in and out ever since. I live in Montpelier now, and I love this area. I love the history, but I didn't know a lot about the early history. I think I knew more about the sort of big picture Abenaki history, but only thought, they're just down in Lake Champlain, or they're along the Connecticut River. Never once in my entire life, whether that's in school or in conversation, did I ever hear anything at all about the native history right here. And so I said, let me go see if I can find any. Maybe there isn't. And so I pulled this off the shelf along with D.P. Thompson, looking through it, and came to this passage. I'll read it for the watchers. On the farm now occupied by Mr. Parker in East Montpelier, a neighbor of George Davis, was a well-defined Indian clearing near the brook, which is identified as Sodom Pond Brook by the East Montpelier Historical Society, and Beaver Meadow. On the brook just named was the scene of an unwitnessed tragedy, probably about 1790. The pioneer and hunter of Berlin, Jacob Fowler, had a line of traps on this brook. In visiting them on several occasions, he found that someone had plundered his fur. At his next visit, an Indian was on the ground just in advance of him, and Fowler discovered him in the act of robbery. They discovered each other simultaneously, and each took shelter behind a huge pine tree. The situation resolved into the case of the death of one of the parties. Now, wow, that's a very interesting way of putting it. Suffice it to say, Fowler was the victor. Well, Jacob Fowler, he's the first settler, as Corinne told us. He was known as a hunter and trapper, an Indian scout. That is not him. It just looks how I imagine him to be. He had a dog that was talked about, Jowler, in all the histories. The Indian was probably Western Abenaki, but maybe Mohawk for reasons we'll look at. And this is 2021 or 2, I think 21. Right after Christmas, my kids and I went and tracked down the brook. And this is where Across the Onion book says it occurred. Did it? We don't know. Is this the exact location? We don't know, but this is what our history tells us. So there's the confusing outcome. Amazing passive voice here, right? This author does not want to say that Fowler directly killed the Indian. And then when you read the rest of the history, you find out that Fowler eventually went to Canada and lived out his last years. And so I thought that was intriguing too. It seems like people would know more than that if this was more than legendary. So I decided, these were my questions that I started to sort of research. Well, where did this Indian come from? I didn't know there were any Indians around here. Was this legendary? According to the story, Fowler was the only one who witnessed this. So that makes it very easy to exaggerate or invent, to tell it in a way that benefits him. And I guess that's my question. How did and why did Fowler shape this story? Unless somebody made it up and told it about him. That's another possibility. Oops. So 3 parts this afternoon. I'm going to track what we can find about Jacob Fowler. We're going to track the Indian and then give my current best theory, which has changed quite a bit in the last few weeks, I think, based on my recent research. Well, Jacob Fowler. He was born in Newbury, Vermont, which was the largest town in northern New England at this time. Very important town, and very, very important for the Revolution and everything leading up to it. His father was a prominent figure, Captain Fowler. They came from southern New Hampshire. Originally, he's the youngest of 5, the only boy, and it's very confusing because he's the third. So multiple times early on, I kept finding Jacob Fowler listed, and I would get confused. No, that's actually his dad, who was the captain, or his grandfather. One very important part of this story that comes up again and again, and that really defines his life, is that he was accused of being a Tory, or he was a loyalist. Now, in Vermont in particular, we have to sort of step back and put aside our assumptions about a patriot, right, and that a Tory was just those obviously wrong people who didn't get the right side of history. This is a very open question, how people negotiated the Revolution. And Vermont wasn't even a colony of the United States, or one of the states originally. So a lot of gray area here. But in the sea of Newbury's Revolutionary War activity, Jacob Fowler, his father, was arrested in 1776 as a Tory with 3 others. And the plot, interestingly, was disclosed by an Indian, the story says. Now, that's not surprising that there would be natives in Newbury. This is traditionally one of the most important villages of the Western Abenaki Coas. And in a recent history that I was reading, there's about 50 natives that were stationed there as part of the war effort, who were loyal to the American forces. And I think that's Goodwin's book about the Royalton Raid, where I saw that. So there's reasons here already that the Fowler family and native people could be having some friction in this area. And Jacob III, our Jacob in question, was said to have fought with the British at the Battle of Bennington, while, though, serving in the Revolutionary Army. He was stationed in Corinth. I have that. Let's go back to the Royalton raid. Yes, he moved to Corinth. I think it's actually earlier than 79. I have to go check. Is that
I'm not positive.
the date? Okay. Long story short, he was already there, though, in 1780 when the Royalton raid happened, the last large Indian raid on the northern frontier. So 300 Mohawk, Abenaki, and British were going to Newbury. That was their target. That was by far the most important military target on the northern frontier. And they were alerted to the fact that Newbury was prepared for them. They knew they were coming. And the story goes is that Jacob Fowler met them at the confluence of the Dog and Winooski River, where he ended up settling about 6 years later. And that's actually, I have to find the newspaper article. I found this article, it's like 1930-ish, where I think it's in Middlesex, they have a play about this, and Fowler's in it, meeting the British. Or mostly the natives. 1779, he moves to Corinth. He spent much of his time trapping and hunting in this area, which was still, quote-unquote, wilderness, right? That was not settled. And there's a very interesting letter here from Colonel Johnson, Thomas Johnson, to George Washington, talking about Jacob Fowler and his buddy, Taplin, who also ends up in Montpelier, and one of the prominent settlers in that area, more prominent than Fowler, his family. About the same time, there went two men about February from Corinth, William Taplin, Jacob Fowler. Their intentions are not yet known to me, but expect they will soon be. Now, this is a military letter that's sort of like detailing the war effort. So layered into this is the suspicion about Taplin and Fowler about their Tory activities. Now, just to zoom out here, the bigger picture of the settlement of Vermont, the lighter areas are the last areas to be settled. So Connecticut River, and here's New York, and the Champlain Valley early before 1768. All of this area up until really the end of the French and Indian War, there was enough pressure from Canada that kept permanent settlement out. And it really wasn't until after the Revolutionary War that people felt safe settling. So this is the charters. Things are getting chartered about 1768 and after, but it wasn't until about 1780, 1785 that you see settlement really starting in the Winooski Valley and north. Well, so Fowler settles in Berlin in 1786. Now, this is not a completely accurate photo. It's the confluence. Here's the Dog River and the Winooski. I'm standing at the under the interstate underpass there. But Fowler's land or settlement would have been a little bit further back, right, closer to the railroad tracks, between. So if you're on the dirt road that goes from the old rec fields, Dog River rec fields, over Dog River Road, yeah. It's going to be to your right. Oh, and here's this great quote. He built his solitary log hut where the railroad now runs, some 60 rods south of the junction of the road with Montpelier Branch. Now, Fowler was filled with all of these adventures and tall tales. He was really sort of a Daniel Boone type figure in this area. I won't go into all of them. We can maybe talk about them in conversation, but this is the one that D.P. Thompson wrote down in his history of Montpelier and used in his novel Gout Gurley. So Fowler was hunting here. That's the Elm Street Cemetery. That's the backside with the Winooski River there. He was by the river. Out of the bush comes a bear, which jumps onto the sandbar, digs a semi-hole, gets on its back, and the catamount comes crashing out of the woods and jumps on the bear, and the bear was prepared and disemboweled the catamount. And so D.P. Thompson, he says, I really don't know about this story. I don't know about this guy Jacob, but I've talked to all the old timers, and so it sounds like this is true, as much as I doubt Jacob. There was this aura around him of mystery and intrigue, if you want to say that. Fowler was a rather peculiar man and seemed to avoid rather than court the acquaintance of the settlers, who believed there was some mystery hanging over his former life, which he was not inclined to disclose. He's one of these people who sort of followed the frontier. You always find him moving on once the town sort of gets built up and the institutions of civilized life come to be. So shortly after Montpelier comes into its own, he ends up moving on. And the legend becomes that he went away to Canada out of fear of retribution for being a Tory. So he always carried that Tory reputation, and so maybe that's why Canada would always seem as a natural destination for him, right? A lot of loyalists left the U.S. and settled in Canada, Nova Scotia, Ontario, because they were still loyal to the crown. But this is what people believed, and that's what our history still says. Corinne passed this along. It's Fowler selling his farm to Jacob Davis in 1793. And you also said when you sent this along, you know, it's funny, I can't find the documentation of how he ever obtained his land.
Yeah. Not yet.
Not yet, but it may not be there. Maybe he got it in an underhanded way. We don't know. Well, anyway, so I'm following the trail, and just a few weeks ago I was in Ontario for work, and I'm driving down the road. This is about an hour north of Toronto, and I saw this sign, and mystery solved. I tracked down the archives, and Jacob Fowler ended up in Fowler's Corner in Ontario, not far from Peterborough.
Good job.
Not quite. It was a totally different Fowler line, unfortunately.
Oh, well.
That happens all the time, right? I mean, you think you got it, and then
Wouldn't that have been a great story?
it would have.
Yes. It's still a good story, it's just not true. It's a very Fowler-esque story. Yeah. So this is the trail that I was able to track down. I'm not super confident about all of it either, because there's multiple Jacob Fowlers out there, and I'm not the best archivist. But I know Corinne and others are going to be fact-checking and making sure that this is accurate. She agrees with me, though, that he appears on multiple censuses at the same time, which I don't know if you shared this or somebody else said, well, you know, Damien, that's understandable, right? Because people traveled. When they got somewhere, they might stay for a couple of weeks. He still had family in Newbury. So if they were taking a census when he was in Newbury, maybe he would get caught there too, or listed. He claims a wolf bounty in 1798 from Berlin.
Yes. That's
in the state records, I believe, in Middlesex. It seems as if he was the first mail carrier from Reigate to Danville. I think that's the rail route, the mail route that he is listed as working. He seems to have moved to Orange at some point, where his daughter marries Joshua Chase. I'd love for you to find this one. Like, if you could pull off a Revolutionary War pension in 1818 while being a Tory. But it seems as if not Canada, but Johnson, Vermont is where he moved and died, and we have his headstone here. And I've convinced, well, I didn't convince you. You tracked this down and said this looks real.
Yeah, it does.
So it seems as if he's buried in Johnson. So different than what our town history says. Okay.
But he could have gone to Canada
He
and
could
then
have.
come back down.
Yes.
Too, so.
He could have gone. Maybe he intended to go, and he changed his mind. He went and he changed his mind. Went to Fowler's Corner. Wasn't what he thought. Vermont's really great. A lot of us do that, and we come back and live out our
And
days.
part of that, I said I was finding information that others in his family were in Johnson too. So it just seems to make more sense if some of his family was there. But I'm not clear yet whether they got there before him, around the same time. I'm not quite sure yet.
Yet.
Is there any connection to the Fowlers that are around the Plainfield area?
I was wondering that because there's Fowler Road, right,
Yeah,
just in the Marshfield line
Our
there.
church, one of the people there is Nancy Fowler. She's married to a Fowler.
So I'm not
There's a
sure,
lot of them.
because I know one time I got tripped up because there's another Fowler line that ended up in Northfield. I think it was maybe starting in 1830s. So, and Fowler's a common name. There was a lot of them in New Hampshire that ended up in Vermont. So I don't know. It's possible. You should ask her.
I will.
Yeah. All right, what can we find out about the quote-unquote Indian? Well, probably, but not entirely certain, was probably Abenaki. And the most important thing to see, okay, so here's Newbury, Coos. This is where Montpelier would be, or Berlin. St. Francis, Odenak, was the largest Abenaki settlement at the time of this incident. And even at this time, Abenaki people would spend a portion of the year at Odenak, and a good portion of the year, many people, down in their traditional homelands. So you'd come down here to hunt, maybe in the winter. You'd go back to St. Francis, where you'd get your kid would be baptized, or there'd be a wedding you'd go to, or you'd go trade. Maybe you'd spend 9 months of the year at Odenak and 3 in Vermont, or vice versa. It was founded in 1700 about, and this is how it looked in the 1800s. And one thing we have to kind of remember is this sort of flips around our stereotypes. We think of Native peoples as being sort of backwards or not as culturally advanced. This was actually an incredibly cosmopolitan place. So it's multi-ethnic. There's over 20 tribes that have been absorbed into this community, including captives, so non-native captives who ascended to leadership roles at times. There was the great white chief of Odenak, of the Abenaki, Gill, I think was his last name. Both his parents were captives. It was very cosmopolitan because they were negotiating first with the French, then with the British, and then they would be continually trading with the Americans back and forth. So people were usually multilingual. They spoke Abenaki, French, English, and maybe at least another native language.
You're saying they were, or
They were.
They were.
They were.
I'm gonna say Americans have never been very good at.
No. So the Americans, like Jacob Fowler, probably only spoke English, right? And this is where, to give an example of this absorption and engagement with European culture in ways with their own. This is a Mohawk example, so you get an example of the dress, right? The incorporation of certain elements of European style, the retention of native style gets blended together. And this is an example of the sort of international character of this community. So this was a wampum belt. Wampum belts were sort of living treaties. They're made with the shells of, now I can't remember which kind of shell, but they were shells that were formed into beads. This, I think, had like about 10,000 beads in it. And the idea was that it was a living document, living covenant. And this was sent to France, to the Cathedral of Chartres. And that was a sort of enactment of their relationship with the French and their engagement with Catholicism. So almost all Abenaki and the Mohawks we'll talk about a little bit were Catholic at the time too, in addition to their own native spirituality. Well, 11,000 beads. So whoever this Indian was part of this sort of international, this complex international community that spanned multiple cultures and was down here in Vermont, but most of the time sort of part of this very complex community. I should have gotten a map and included, outside of Montreal is the Mohawk Reserve, and Mohawks had started going to the Montreal area once they started becoming, those who were becoming Catholic, and formed their own community. But that's much closer to Vermont than where they would have been from, and closer to Vermont than Odanak. And Mohawks were some of the strongest allies to the French, and they utilized the Winooski as their sort of main corridor to getting to New England, for whether that was for raiding or trading. So like the Deerfield raid in 1703, down about here, that was the route they took to sack Deerfield. So long story short is, there's always been a question of the eastern side of Lake Champlain. Was this Mohawk territory, which the Mohawks claim, or was it always Abenaki? It was probably both, but my sense is that as the Mohawk came up to Montreal and became more active in this area, they started making more use of the Winooski Valley corridor. They actually just discovered Randolph. The original settlement of Randolph was because there was 3 Mohawks in Hanover, New Hampshire, talking about what a beautiful place where Randolph Village is now. The sort of meeting of the three branches there. And so the original settler,
Which that was West Randolph.
West Randolph.
Randolph, the current Randolph Village started being West Randolph, and it was the railroad and all going through that made it the center for their
Okay.
commerce. It was up Randolph Center was
The original,
the original.
got it.
Where was that, Randolph Center?
Randolph Center, when you get off exit 4, you go up the hill.
Yep.
Randolph Center, that.
Oh yeah,
was-
like where VTC is.
Right.
Yes.
In fact, it has a nice wide road because they thought that maybe they'd become the state capital, and they didn't.
Well, that's kind of like Montpelier Center was the originally intended center of Montpelier, and everybody said, "Now let's go down to the river. That's where all the commerce is, and all the floods."
Yeah.
Right?
Big mistake.
Big mistake. But even back then, they were like, we see evidence of flooding when they were coming in, the original settlers, and they were wary of it. Okay. So this is the map you see right over here. All of the different trails that
Richard Nye.
Richard Nye tracked down and that Harris is now working on. I think I have some of your work here. Do you want to just give a minute of
Yeah, I've spent so much time with that Nye map, and it was super helpful to map out these trails. It's this kind of a side project I'm doing. There are no modern maps, current mapping standards that I can find of these native trails, so that'd be a good thing to try to do. Not this, but nearby, was the main connector between the Connecticut River Valley and the Winooski River Valley. And that's why a bunch of the trails intersected here.
Mhm.
Some of them are easy to locate, some of them are not, but I'm gonna keep looking into it.
So I'm assuming that part of this map there includes Coos Trail?
Yes, it does. Yep, that's,
Come up and show us.
here. It's Coos Trail. I thought it was really interesting. I was looking at the Millstone trails,
Yeah.
that whole big trail system, and there's got to be 50 trails up there. I don't know. And one of them is named Indian Trail. And according to what I was researching, that trail did go up through Graniteville. Why? I don't know. I don't know why they wouldn't have gone around that, but that's what I think it was from Nye, the written part.
Yeah.
That it goes right through Graniteville. So I tried to contact the Millstone people, like, where do you know where that name came from? Or I haven't heard anything back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Interesting.
Keep us updated.
Okay.
Yeah. So in the Gazetteer, for 3 pages, the Jacob Fowler story is the last paragraph of these 3 pages. There's all this detail of what the original settlers of Montpelier saw in terms of the archaeological footprint. Now, a lot of this has been washed away or plowed over, but fairly extensive. So numerous kitchen middens, those giant piles of freshwater clams that used to abound in the rivers that were gathered when people would eat. There was the Indian village, so the confluence of Kingsbury and Winooski River. That's where the Kate Farm is, right? In fact, I have a photo of this. This is from, oops. This is where it would have been. Kate Farm is sort of back here, and there's a cemetery too overlooking it. Cornfields, the writer estimate to have been cultivated 30 to 35 years before settlement, which seems to me to be like an accurate number. So that would have been right up until the end of the French and Indian War, which after that, settlement still wasn't possible, but it was too dangerous, I think, to be settled as a native person in this area and be cultivating actively.
This might be a good spot to note that when you had a picture up earlier of Elm Street Cemetery,
Yeah.
people think that Elm Street Cemetery was one of the first in Montpelier. It actually wasn't. It was over in the Meadow,
Yes.
somewhere around Summer Pearl Street, somewhere
I found
there.
the article that says Winter Street.
Well,
You find that?
there,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
We can talk about it at
Okay.
some point. But what's interesting is that there are a couple of references in with that, and the bodies were relocated to Elm Street and to Greenmount Cemetery, but there is a reference somewhere in there of Indian mounds too.
So I found
Yeah.
there's a couple references, and what they say is that the original burial site that the settlers used was the burial site of the natives. It was like a sand mound in the meadows. And then it was 1855 when they finally disinterred everything that was there by diverting the stream to wash away all the sand.
And they found a few more remains that
Yeah.
had to be taken care of too.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's also a fortification at the confluence of Sodom Pond Brook. That's the brook that the murder allegedly occurred on, and the Winooski. And then axes, earthen urn, and cannonball found at the Cutler Cemetery.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Cannonballs I found interesting,
Yeah.
that they would identify that as like a native.
Wow.
All right, so we also have ongoing sort of native engagement with this area. Indian Joe, you've probably all heard of Indian Joe, very famous Vermont figure. Originally Mi'kmaq from Nova Scotia, adopted by Abenaki, married to an Abenaki woman. He was very involved at Newbury. He fought with the Americans, met George Washington, and there's a story of him being asked to shake the hand of somebody who he considered to be of ill repute. And he said, "I will not shake that man's hand. This hand shook George Washington's hand, and
Oh
they will
my
not
goodness.
touch that man."
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
This is 1789, so this is a year or two before the Fowler incident. In Wolcott, the first settler, Seth Hubble, brings his family up. This is April, the starving time, and Joe sort of saves his life by trading a moose for the shirt that Seth was wearing. Sounds like an act of charity. But the history has Indian Joe sort of all over northern West Washington County. And I think this is technically outside of Washington County, but Joe's Pond and Molly's Pond. Molly was his wife, and very famous. And the reason they have the name Joe and Molly is that Joseph and Mary, Molly is the Abenaki pronunciation of Mary. That's the most common Abenaki names because they were Catholic and they would take those names.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Yes. And there's the sons. There's a whole other rabbit trail of the murder. One of their sons kills another Indian and is executed, and is recorded saying his Catholic prayers before the execution in Newbury. just another thing, I just found this morning. I hadn't seen this before. Also in the Gazetteer, just in a different section. Old Joe used to make frequent visits to Montpelier, stopping for a few days with a family living in an old log house a little out of the village on the east side of Worcester Branch, so not far from the cemetery, just on the other side. There he used to run bullets from lead ore found by him on land a little west of what is now called Wright's Mills. Where's Wright's Mills? Is that where Wrightsville Dam would have got its name? Yeah. Anyway, so Indian Joe is running around. He was very often in Woodbury. He'd find himself in sort of Stowe, Wolcott area, but mostly in Washington County. And then Danville, just outside of Washington County, about 20 miles from where the murder would have occurred. This is an account from 1800. And this is the pond. Oh, did I not move the quote up? Let's see. I do have the quote here somewhere. I guess I don't. This is a beautiful quote of this family that would frequent this hill that it used to stay at before the settlers showed up. And they decided, got too busy, so they would hang out at this pond. They would still go to that hill and ask to borrow this brass kettle. And so they would borrow it. And the person remembering this said they always brought it back with two things. One, it had been newly polished so that you could see yourself in the kettle. And second, it was always filled with fish or venison in return. And that they continued to come back, this band of Abenaki. So, my best current theory. Last section here. This has to, I think, sort of, it's very speculative on my part. But it has to come. It comes from D.P. Thompson, who is by far the best historian of this area. His history of Montpelier is wonderful. He wrote about 10 different historical fiction books. And he, as Corinne mentioned, he incorporates real stories into his fiction. He's very dependent on real history. And he incorporated that bear catamount battle into his novel Gout Girlie, which is also about a trapper hunter killing a native person, but is based on a real story in northern Maine, or northern New Hampshire, Errol, New Hampshire. And I got to this book, it's a compilation of short stories, The Shaker Lovers and Other Tales, and in it, this is his quote, I forgot the quotation marks at the beginning, "The following tales, though relating to matters of a domestic and local character, are yet founded more strictly on facts than any of the author's composition. All of them, indeed, are but illustrations of actual incidents." So towards the end, I got to the story, An Indian's Revenge. And it's about 7-8 pages long, and it's this story about this settler family living in a cabin by the river, and the narrator visiting them, and while he's there, the husband comes rushing into the house and blocks the doors off and says, "Grab my gun," tells his wife to get the gun. And while he's looking out the window, the wife tells the story of why this is happening. A very long, convoluted story about how this main character had been hunting in Lake Memphremagog, had befriended this wounded Indian, nursed him back to health, and then they became fast friends. On a later trip, he was back out hunting with his dog. In the middle of the night, he hears what sounds like a catamount screaming close to his tent. So he takes his rifle, he shoots into the darkness, and later discovers that he had shot his friend. The friend didn't die fast enough for Fowler to get there, and for Fowler not to get there, and his friend sees that it was Sorry, I shouldn't say Fowler. The main character sees him, and there's this look of recognition on the Indian's face, like, "Oh, you didn't really mean it," and he passes away. But there were a number of friends that this Indian was with, and the main character knows that they're going to know about what happened. And so the rest of the story becomes him racing to get away. He jumps into the lake with his dog, paddles across the lake, flees back to his home, and he thinks he's safe. But they know who he is, and so they keep coming back periodically, showing up, hoping to settle the score. And so Fowler decides there's nothing to do but flee out into the woods and try to get away. And so he does. The Indians eventually leave. And the last paragraph is this. Several years later, I was journeying through the town and passed the same dwelling. It was desolate and tenantless. And the weeds and bushes had grown up where I had before seen fields of waving grain. On inquiry, I learned that the former occupant, having again been haunted by the Indians, and perhaps still more by his own imagination, had removed into the western country, without informing even his nearest neighbors of his intended residence. So if you were masking this story, Fowler's story, from the Gazetteer, the murder in East Montpelier, and Jacob's eventual disappearance in Canada, this would be the way you might do it. It seems to match up perfectly. There's a number of questions, though. Why would D.P. Thompson, if he knew the story of Fowler to be a historical event, why did he not include it in his history of Montpelier? Because he doesn't. D.P. Thompson does not mention this, despite extended meditation on Jacob Fowler in the beginning of his history of Montpelier. So it would mean either that I'm just reading into this, and this does not relate to Fowler, or D.P. Thompson didn't want to include this in the history because he felt he didn't believe it, or maybe it impugned the character of Montpelier somehow. Now, I should also say that D.P. Thompson wrote a whole book about King Philip's War, the early 1600s, or is it late 1600s, southern New Hampshire war between the southern tribes and the colonial government. And he was very sympathetic. He was very interested in natives, and I think as much as anyone of his age, unprejudiced by a lot of the stereotypes. So I'm not sure if my theory is accurate, what D.P. Thompson would have been thinking not to have included this. So here's some of my conclusions, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I think overall, I lean toward it did happen in some form. There's some reasons why I'm not certain. One of why didn't, if it did happen, D.P. Thompson knew this, why didn't he put it in the history? The other thing is that I think there's only one source for this, the Gazetteer. And I think that everybody who talks about it is referring back to that. And so I don't know why there wouldn't have been sort of another line, a different version or allusion to it at an earlier time, or sort of at a separate place, right? That wasn't obviously drawn from this one source. I think that this was not an isolated Indian, that there must have been a band involved, and that's most importantly because Native people are never by themselves, right? So we think of Fowler being this lone wolf, living, Daniel Boone type, trapping and hunting by himself. Native people never did that. In fact, the worst punishment you could inflict on a Native person is banishment. They typically didn't have capital punishment, because if you banish someone, you go live by yourself, it's almost certain that you're not going to survive. It's really, really difficult to do. So there must have been other people around. And I hadn't thought of this till Mike suggested it. It might have been connected to Indian Joe and his family, right? He was making use of this area. It's possible it was one of his sons or a relative of some kind. He suggested before He saw the actual text. The text does use he, but he said, his wife disappears from the historical record right about 1790. Maybe it was his wife. Were there two Fowlers? Kind of went over that. It's possible. I think that everything we've talked about is the right Fowler. But the biggest question to me is, how did he disappear in plain sight if he did end up in Johnson? It's not that small of a world. People, I don't know, a number of people as giving these talks have emphasized, we think of these communities as being very insular and people never moving around. And when you even, like looking at Fowler, he is all over the place. People traveled a lot. They were very well connected. And this brings me to an insight that this is Gail Golick. She works with Robert Goodby, who does great work as an archaeologist, has a book on like 13,000 years of Abenaki history in New Hampshire. But she said, it's almost certain that Jacob Fowler and the Indian knew each other. This is a very small world. Newbury, you read the history, natives were always around. If Jacob Fowler was a scout, he was involved in the war, this would have been an old acquaintance. Julie Perrin from Library Jaffrey's in southern New Hampshire, she said, Damien, in my family, we have all these stories of our ancestors having what are called fur fights. This sort of drops out of our understanding, but this was the highest value commodity other than gold that you could obtain in North America. It was incredibly valuable, and people were constantly fighting over it. And so that the fact that two people may have had an argument to the death over some trapping in central Vermont is very plausible. I will leave you with just that image again from Sodom Pond Brook is down this line of trees. And I'm curious what other thoughts you might bring to this.
I think one of the biggest things you said right there at the end, as far as like the shared history, right? People did move around. And I remember just being wowed when I found out that Jacob Fowler was in the Corinth history book, right? I immediately had to get a copy of it. And I realized that for as much as I do work with some of the other historical societies, I haven't necessarily looked through their histories or asked them all the questions maybe I should, right? Because, our Jacob Fowler, he was over in East Montpelier and Newbury and Corinth and Johnson. And I'm thinking about it, I don't even know when the first settlers got to Johnson, right? All of a sudden I have way more questions than I already did. But it's so important for us to, those who are interested in history, to share information and to look more than just at what we have. I've been all about gathering Berlin things, but it's just as important to look beyond our boundaries and to find people who are interested in a particular topic. I have somebody who's interested in early electricity. He's reading through some diaries that we have, and it's just, you find somebody who wants to focus on a topic, and it's fantastic, right? And who wants to look at a map, which I've always just kind of looked at and gone, somebody like you, Harris, who wants to go deeper with it. And all that is just so important, because I think we're going to end up finding out more. Yeah. It's a matter of how, when, what's going to bring it together. And the fact that things can be found online now, back when my mom used to do genealogy work and all, it was visiting cemeteries, visiting town clerks' offices, writing letters, doing that type of work, whereas now we have the ability to sit in the comfort of our home and try to pull out information and connect through emails, which a conversation might be nicer, but an email helps document it, and I can send it off anytime I want, and you'll get it when it's convenient.
Well, like the descendant of Jacob Fowler from Washington State,
yeah,
that you you emailed and she wrote back and she sort of recounted the history that we knew,
Yeah.
but that she believed that was Jacob Fowler in question and Johnson.
And so, yeah, I mean, the way that we can reach out and find stuff and do stuff, you know, Berlin hasn't been quick at putting lots of information out on the internet, and I almost wonder if we should more with people using AI more and all. It's only as good as the information it has. So when I'm feeling lazy and I don't want to look at my own records for what was the year that Berlin went from being in Orange County to Jefferson County, which then got renamed Washington County?
Mm-hmm.
ChatGPT is just telling me Berlin is in Washington County. I'm like, I know that. You know, but if it doesn't have any source online
Yeah.
that it can grab that from, then it doesn't know it. So we also have to be careful with all the stuff that's out there, but maybe the historical societies should be adding more to it to
Yeah.
allow people to do that research.
When I was doing the mapping, I, was just in my home office, looking at the Coas Road and where it comes out near the airport, and looking at the Nye reference, and it talks about the old someone's house, I can't remember her name, or brick house. So I go on Google Maps and look, and like, boom, there's the brick house. Yep, I'm in the right spot.
Yep.
It was amazing. Yeah. But having said that, there are some other locations that I want to figure out where they are, which either you or someone probably can just tell me. I could probably find it with a lot of research, but I'd like to talk to you.
Sure.
Yeah, I've been struck both by the sort of amazing power of the resources we have now. So like the mail carrier thing, that was in the history of Reigate, that he was listed as the first mail carrier. And
Yeah.
like, I never would have looked in Reigate, right?
Exactly.
But because of the search engines we have now, that can happen instantaneously, which would never probably happen. But then also impressed in how important like these living repositories of sources and wisdom, right? Where you can just go, Corinne, I can ask you, and you could answer these questions that could take me, well, I may never be able to figure out with this morass of
Yeah.
content that I have to sift through and try to figure out, right? So it's how
Well,
important you still are.
And it's funny though, because I'm trying harder to have more regular office hours at the Berlin Historical Society, and I want people to come visit and all, but I always love it if they can give me a heads up for what kind of thing they're looking for. So I have a little chance to wrap my head around it and think about what resources they might be,
Yeah.
because if they just come in and ask me questions, it's hard for me to carry on a conversation and be thinking about what are the resources that I have that I can help
Yes.
connect them up with.
Another thing that it came up, I didn't incorporate this yet. One of my new sort of skeptical thoughts about Fowler ending up in Johnson and how just people knew each other. How would he have been able to live out his life if the D.P. Thompson story is true?
Right.
They would have found him in Johnson too, right? I believe. Like if it's connected particularly with Indian Joe.
You mean other Indians if
Yes.
they wanted revenge?
If they wanted revenge, I don't know how he would have been able to sort of live out his life in central Vermont and that not happen. So I don't know if that's clear, but that's a new sort of skepticism that I have of my
Well,
theory.
what I'm finding kind of interesting is the Royalton raid was like the the only big Indian
Yes.
thing in Vermont, but clearly there had been many Native Americans in Vermont, whether staying here, passing through, however it worked. I don't know how much time they necessarily spent anywhere before moving on, but I just find it kind of interesting that there aren't more mentions of Indians, Native Americans in the history stuff, and why Why is that? You know, just as you say, why didn't D.P. Thompson include something like, why weren't there more mentions, whether it be of deaths? Because certainly this Indian was not, if this Indian was there, was killed, certainly it's not the only death of either a Native American or of a white person. Because we're talking late 1700s.
Yes.
And
My
so-
theory is, there were more Indians, and then, you know, when the diseases came through in the 1600s, most of them died.
But even, I think you're saying even after that, so I wanted to go to this quote because this is, first time I saw this was today, and this is Brigham. Are you familiar with this name? I feel like he's a prominent Central Vermont figure. I have to go check that out. But he says this in the beginning: some of the tribe of St. Francis Indians, that's Abenakis, a family of the Algonquins, have lived around the eastern border or within the limits of this county until their families were extinct. Among these were Captain John and Joe. So I read this sentence as they were living in the eastern part of Washington County until Captain John and Joe's generation left. And if that's the case, I mean, we're talking about a pretty significant gap in any sort of reporting or mention or history of these people. If it's accurate. I mean, I don't know if this is accurate, but this was considered to be the accurate history of the time. And if Fowler encountered one of these and there was the murder, that's the sort of little tip of the iceberg we have of this, their families in the eastern part of Washington County.
And what do they mean by extinct?
Right. Because
They all died.
they
moved.
they almost always, there'd be deaths, but they almost always relocated,
Yeah.
right? They didn't just go extinct like the dinosaurs.
Right.
Well, in the D.P. Thomas story, where the Indians are coming along and he's taking off, and if there was revenge, it was against him particularly,
Yes.
because it's not like the rest of the family
No,
were
they had a
killed
specific
or
target,
the
yes.
thing burned down or anything. And so was it truly a unusual fight about the furs, and maybe they looked and tried for a while, but then decided that maybe enough good had happened between these people, or maybe he was somehow still helping them?
Or there enough
they were-
retribution had been meted
Yeah.
out that they decided it was enough.
Yeah, I mean,
The two other stories that are relevant, again, like I never heard these growing up. So the story, have you heard about the Williamstown hunters from Charleston, New Hampshire?
no.
So this is, it's like 1754, the history goes, that a party of hunters from Charleston, New Hampshire came to Williamstown area. And this is, I only know this because my kids play soccer there, Saldy Recreational Fields, which is like about a mile south of town. They encountered 6 Indians and killed 5 of them. And 1 survived. And then the story goes on to say that 1 made sure, like pursued them until he had enacted his revenge. I should have put the slide in here
Oh,
because there was something like he got one of them down a well or. Anyway, so that's at the Williamstown history.
1750.
1754, so way before settlement. This is just a
Right.
hunting party that's coming up.
Yeah,
And the second one is Fayston.
yeah.
This is 1804, I think, that this threat or the power of the Indian raid was still prominent enough that a neighbor tricked like some family members into believing that an active raid was occurring. And everyone freaked out and acted as if there was. So they believed it, that it was still possible at that time. So 15 years earlier, and the aftermath would definitely have been plausible. Not, again, that they're taking over the they're winning back the territory for the tribe, but that they are able to enact revenge for an injustice.
You know, back when these old newspapers that I love to visit, there was an awful lot, they were dense, right? Lots of mentions of all kinds of stuff. And people read them cover to cover, and other newspapers picked up bits of information from them and repeated them in other papers. But I had never really thought about what aren't they putting in the newspaper. Like nowadays you think of that, right, as far as whether something's making the news or not, but what back then wouldn't have made the news and why?
Yes.
As far as, so do you not want it in the newspaper that there are some Indian issues because you don't want to scare people away from coming to your place?
And D.B. Thompson was a newspaper man.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's just kind of interesting too, because I was kind of taking it that everything made it into the newspaper, but maybe not.
No, we like we have our editorial lens for sure, and we're very protective of our communities, particularly if you're a power broker in the community, right?
Yeah.
You are actively shaping the perception of, you know, what you're portraying to the outside world.
Yeah.
So.
Huh.
So I guess ultimately we can wrap up and then have an informal conversation if that continues. I still don't know what to make of this other than it definitely, speaking in mostly New Hampshire, other parts of Vermont, and picking up histories, you do find a lot of these stories that are taken as true. Like there was this substrata of violence, and not just between natives and non-natives. Like this was the reality of colonial life. This is before civil institutions, you know, the law and law enforcement were really functioning. And so your Fowlers of the world, they made their own justice. And the natives did as well. So, if not literally true, I think this captures the character of this time period in northern Vermont.
And kind of sadly, I will be adding it to the Berlin Historical Society murder binder. You know, which, you know, even though we can't say it's definitive, that it certainly bears looking at that
It's an open case. Right?
It likely happened. It was plausible for it to happen. I'm not quite sure what word to use, but you know, and just trying to keep it open to people.
And the very, very last thing to say is that if you go into the Gazetteer, I believe, they have a very detailed story of Indian Joe where they tell in great detail the murder case of one of his sons. In a way that's kind of like, we want to make sure to air the dirty laundry. And you're left wondering, like, how could we know all this detail? How definitive is it? And also, why are we sort of living this out so completely? In a way that, if you go back to the original language, let's get back to the language, because it's the most fascinating thing to me of all. It's as if no one actually did anything. Just someone ends up dead.
Perhaps because there were no witnesses.
I guess. But you could also say, you know, you could qualify it by still making the language active.
Sure.
By still sort of naming what the story, the accepted story is. And we don't want to do that here. And D.P. Thompson, that's another thing. Like he could have concluded this and said, I don't think it's likely that it's true, but he didn't touch it.
Right.
So anyway, thank you very much. I enjoyed sharing this. Thank you for your thoughts.